Hari Om Namaha Om Hari Vidasyan Mama Sarva Rakshangani Astang Ripadmaha Padagendra Prishte Dvarichamasi Gadesh Chapa Pashanthano Ashtagano Ashtabahu Vidikshadikshward Vamadaha Samantad Antarbahir Bhagavan Narasingaha Prahapaya Lokapayang Swanena Spatejasa Grasta Samasta Tejaha. In a 1958 letter to the Prime Minister of India, His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada wrote, "The history of the West, beginning from the time of the Greeks and the Romans down to the modern age of atomic war, is a continuous chain of sense gratificatory materialism, and the result is that Westerners were never in peace within the memory of 3,000 years of historical records. Neither it will be possible for them at any time in the future to live in peace until the message of spiritualism does not reach their heart." The Supreme Lord is the creator of everything, which means that he existed when there was no creation. His history is eternal, which ultimately means he has no material history. As such, we must receive knowledge about him from a person to whom the Lord has revealed himself. There is no value in creating an imaginary history about the Supreme Lord. We cannot assign to him any material designations in time either, but as far as humanity is concerned, there are many such material designations in time. As the famous aphorism goes, the past is prologue. Or as George Orwell put it, who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. It is incumbent upon the Lord's devotees to now take control of the historical narrative of Prabhupada's movement. We are unable to do this by picking up the expressions of drivel from an institutional delusion. The real history of what went down in Srila Prabhupada's movement cannot be ascertained by regurgitating definitions from the fabricated so-called ISKCON Confederation. We shall only be able to understand the transcendental position of Lord Chaitanya when we accurately comprehend his eternal movement by first rejecting the ISKCON narrative. This was indirectly confirmed by Srila Prabhupada in 1970. If people actually want peace and tranquility, they must support this movement wholeheartedly, and we shall execute our prescribed duties very seriously and sincerely. In this way, if we are given a chance, I am sure we will enact a new chapter in the history of the Western world. ISKCON, however, does not give the people of the world this chance. It is imperative that we become conversant with the historical information while it is still available, despite the fact that it is constantly being twisted and warped by ISKCON along with its splinter groups such as Ritvik. We must transcend, overcome, and expose their complicit historical ignorance. Only honest devotees can overcome all the bogus narratives that are out there right now and comprehend the import of Prabhupada's movement. Understanding that real history requires simply sincerity and seriousness. It does not necessarily require that one first become a pure devotee. The urge to preach the real history of Prabhupada's still fledgling movement is not at all material. However, we cannot carry out his mission if we do not first understand what dire straits it is in now. Becoming free from material desires is one thing, but insisting upon knowing the actual history of his movement is what is our birthright at this time. His divine grace presented, through his example and powerful preaching, the pure message of Bhagavad Gita, and he implemented that message in the form of his movement. It manifested for the first time in the West when Malechas, who were not raised according to any Vedic standards, accepted his message and followed his Vaishnava principles. Prabhupada is on record as saying that this was his only credit. We honor Prabhupada when we overcome the ISKCON narrative. That means presenting the history of Prabhupada's movement and presenting the history of ISKCON as it is and what transpired within it. And we especially honor his divine grace when we impress upon all spiritually evolved people the deep philosophy and culture of transcendence that is present in Prabhupada's movement as it is and as he brought it to the West through the agency of the Guru Parampara. Acharyavan Purusho Veda. The man with a bona fide acharya knows what is what. Now, his divine grace began to actually collect disciples and incorporated his movement in the middle of 1966. He initiated his first disciples in the summer of 66 and in the fall of 1966. And the last year that he was still physically manifest, 1977, for almost all of it, or you could even say all of it, he was in a very bad physical condition. So his preaching movement basically was 11 years, and almost every devotee would agree to that. Now, from your host's analysis, during those 11 years of his active preaching in the West and in India, there were 10 major crises. 4 of those 10 were in relation to his physical condition. In other words, at 4 times, he either almost left us, or in the 4th time, he did leave us. The other 6 crises were in relation to his disciples and what they were doing and how they were mismanaging his movement. We're going to briefly touch upon one physical crisis here in this discourse, but basically it's going to focus upon the first 4 crises, of which 3 of them are in relation to his disciples. Now, the first crisis was in 1967. The first crisis was in 1967, in the summer of 67, when his divine grace developed severe heart palpitations at his New York center, which was the first center he had established. So he had one of his intimate disciples, Kirtananda Prabhu, in the next room, who would come in at night at various times when he called for him and massage his rib cage and his chest in order to keep the heart palpitations at bay. Eventually it was decided that he should go to the hospital, where he was given severe allopathic treatment, including a spinal tap of all things. The hospital visit was a mistake, and he did not improve, and just one day he decided, I'm leaving, and just picked up and left. He then went to the New Jersey coast briefly, where some disciples were serving him in order to try to help him regain his health, but he decided that he had to go back to India for two reasons. One, he rightly understood that his health could be recuperated there best, and two, in case he was not going to turn the corner, then he wanted to be in the holy Dham of Vrindavan. Well, as it turns out, once he got back to India, he quickly regained his health, especially the heat of India helped him. He went there in the late summer of '67, and he was accompanied by Kirtananda, his personal servant, and Achyutananda joined him a bit later in September. Now, in early September, at the Janmashtami ceremony, he gave Kirtananda Das the title Kirtananda Swami and made him his first sannyas. Here was a statement he made a bit later. Kirtananda is now a completely Krishna-conscious person, as he has accepted sannyas on the birthday of Lord Krishna with great success. There is much to learn from this, so we shall go to the next excerpt. That was from September 5th. 22 days later, on September 27th, Prabhupada writes to, ironically, Hayagriva in New York. We'll find out why that's ironic in a few moments. I gave him, meaning Kirtananda, I gave him one important introduction letter. Although he had in his mind not to stop at London, and yet promised before me that he would go, for which I gave him an extra $20. I cannot understand why he played with me like this. It has certainly given me a great shock. If he does like this, how can I prosecute my programs? After Prabhupada gave sannyas to Kirtananda, he gave him an order. And we make advancement in Krishna consciousness when we follow the orders of the Guru, and that is the chief way that we make advancement. He gave him an order to visit an elderly woman who was part of the Gaudiya Math, who had established some kind of center of some sort in London, who was willing to help Prabhupada establish a center in London, which was very important to him for a number of reasons. So Kirtananda was given this important order, but he went straight to Heathrow, and then from Heathrow went straight to New York City. He didn't even bother stopping in London to see the woman. He disobeyed the order, which, as Prabhupada says here, gave him a great shock. Actually, there's a typographical error in the typing of the letter, which has a humorous element to it. Instead of shock, S-H-O-C-K, the typist typed sock, S-O-C-K, which also is applicable, that Prabhupada was given a punch by Kirtananda by this act of disobedience. Of course, we know, especially when those who are raised in India speak the English language, they aspirate the H in various words. Whereas we say shock and the H is clearer, they sometimes aspirate it. And because of that, the dictaphone, it sounded like sock, and the personal secretary typed it as sock. At any rate, we see here that Prabhupada says that Kirtananda was a perfectly Krishna-conscious person at September 5th. But then on September 22nd, he is anything but. So this should help us to understand the principle of encouragement that Prabhupada constantly used. There was a provisional element to Kirtananda becoming a perfectly Krishna conscious person. And when he did not meet that provision any longer, he no longer was a perfectly Krishna conscious person, as we shall see in the subsequent excerpts from the letters. In other words, free will is what it is. And when it is misused, then whatever someone may have been before that, he no longer is. Therefore, when Prabhupada makes statements about various devotees in his letters and what their status is, it should always be understood that it's provisional. Next, we have a letter from October 6th. So basically, one month and 1 day after Prabhupada said that Kirtananda was a completely Krishna conscious person, he writes this to Satsvarup Das in New York City, one of his prominent disciples in New York City at that time, October 6, 1967. Kirtananda may be eager to address in the Harvard University, but recently he has lost his link on account of disobedience. Very recently, Kirtananda has developed a different consciousness of Maya, which is called misuse of one's minute independence offered by Krishna. So from being a completely Krishna conscious person to having lost his link to the Guru Parampara is quite a chasm. But that, within 1 month and 1 day, is what had transpired due to disobedience. This is the first crisis. It's the second one, of course, in relation to the first crisis being Prabhupada's having to go back to India to regain his health. But this is the first devotee crisis. So then, on November 9th, so now we're talking 2 months and 3 days, he writes to Raya Rama, who also was defending Prabhupada strongly during this time, because when Kirtananda went back to New York City, he took a devotee out of the New York temple, and that was Hayagriva, his homosexual partner from the Mott Street days in New York. So Hayagriva and Kirtananda left the New York temple. They were more or less driven out by the powerful disciples there who did not accept how they said that the movement should be, because they were saying that should give up the dhoti, give up the tilak, wear standard Western clothes, and preach in this way, going against what Prabhupada had established. So now in this letter to Raya Rama on November 9th, Kirtananda has already left with Hayagriva. They're in Cleveland, or Hayagriva's in Ohio. He may not be in Cleveland. He was a professor at Ohio State in Columbus. Kirtananda is walking around Cleveland in priest garb, black priest garb, and also I heard he still kept his danda, but he put black cloth around it instead of orange cloth. So he's walking the streets in this new way of preaching, which was not Prabhupada's movement. And there Prabhupada says, Kirtananda is a crazy man. That is proved. He says that he has become equal to the spiritual master, but he is such a fool that he does not understand the principle of disciple. If such disciple is not maintained, no establishment can make any progress. Such discipline. If such discipline is not maintained, no establishment can make any progress. It actually is typed here in the letter as disciple, but it certainly meant discipline, because Prabhupada was talking about disciplinary principle just previous to it. So, from being a perfectly, completely Krishna conscious person to 2 months and 3 days later being labeled by Prabhupada a crazy man, that was a crisis, because it would create doubt. We can be quite certain that when that letter came to Hayagriva in New York, that Kirtananda is now a completely Krishna conscious person, that was shared with all the disciples there. Perhaps it was even posted up on a bulletin board. Quite likely. Now, within 2 months, he's a crazy man, of course. Kirtananda was in Bellevue before he became a devotee, before Prabhupada came into contact with him. But what we need to know from this particular crisis is that, one, it was overcome. In other words, it was uprooted. And two, that Prabhupada's right-hand man, his best man, etc., his best men, all these terminologies that are still utilized for obvious self-serving reasons, they need to be looked at with skepticism, particularly in consideration of what has gone down in the last 40 years. Prabhupada said many things about his leading disciples that must now be considered as nothing more than encouragement. Not that these laudatory statements that he made every now and then about one or two of them were set in stone. They were provisional. And that was proved very clearly in this 1967 incident with Kirtananda. Prabhupada had to rely on the devotees who still remained strongly attached to him in New York City, and eventually this crisis was overcome. The next crisis was in relation to 4 of his leading devotees in the period of late 1969 and 1970 mostly. Now, I am going to name these devotees. 2 of them are still living. So when I name them, it should not be considered that I am targeting those 2 devotees who are still physically manifest, who are still living. I have no negative energy towards either one of them. I've never met either one of them, but they engaged in very important service to His Divine Grace. They were very effective. They were dear to Prabhupada, as were all 4 of the men. But they deviated, and it was a major crisis. So these 4 men were Brahmananda, who actually was the start of the whole thing, Vishnu Jan, Subal, and Gargamuni, Brahmananda's younger brother. Subal and Gargamuni, to the best of my knowledge, are still alive. And again, this is not being targeted against them now. It was a long time ago. And the crisis was uprooted. So, we shall read some excerpts about this crisis. Now, what's interesting here in the letters about this particular crisis, and remember, we're talking about the historical narrative, which has been whitewashed and covered over, and many of you who are, so at least some of you who are viewing this discourse, probably never even knew about some of these crises, or perhaps not about any of them, particularly the one we're going to cover after this one. But what's interesting about this particular crisis is that Prabhupada did not write about it in his letters while it was going on. There's really virtually no indication of it while it was going on. That was a tactic he used, a very effective tactic. We could discuss why he used that. But he wrote about it somewhat extensively after it had been uprooted. So by the time here, this letter to Hunksduda, which is a very well-known letter, an extremely important letter, September 2nd, 1970, wherein he says about the crisis, regarding the poisonous effect in our society, it is a fact, and I know wherefrom this poison tree has sprung up, and how it affected practically the whole society in a very dangerous form. I am still in darkness about the proceedings in New Vrindavan, but I have heard that Brahmananda is preaching about me, that I am Krishna, that I am Supersoul, that I have withdrawn my mercy from the disciples, that I have left the society, and so on. I do not know how far they are correct. So you can think over very deeply how to save the situation. It is a fact, however, that the great sinister movement is within our society. Now, it was still going on at this time, but it had actually been more or less stopped. This is an in-depth topic, but Prabhupada had created the G.B.C. as an unincorporated entity in the summer of 1970. And in no small part, the governing body commission was created in order to uproot this crisis that was being spread throughout the movement of wrong preaching, a wrong understanding of His divine grace, and also some subsidiary conspiracy to centralize the whole movement in Greenwich Village. In the summer of 1970, His divine grace almost entirely, if not entirely, was at his Los Angeles center. From what I have heard, from what your host has understood through the grapevine, he was locked in his room for a long time there. Obviously, he was given food and everything, but prasadam. But there was a takeover going on in relation to these four men, centered around them. And they were saying that Prabhupada was God. Not Sakshat Hari, servant of God, but actually the Supreme Lord Himself. And they were saying that He was the Paramatma directly, and that He no longer loved His disciples or had confidence in them, and He had withdrawn His mercy from them, and therefore it was up to them now to take radical measures to prove to him once again that his movement would spread in the right way, because obviously he was supposedly displeased with them. So part of this new conspiracy was, and this wrong preaching was part of it, but another part of it was they were going to centralize, they're going to wrap up all the centers that he had established, which weren't that many at that time, but Santa Fe and Los Angeles and San Francisco, New York, Montreal. And they were going to centralize all the centers in Greenwich Village for the purpose of preaching, because that was where you could make the most devotees, was the mentality. So none of this was approved by Prabhupada. And it was a major crisis because these four men were very influential in the movement. Brahmananda was the first temple president of New York City, and Vishnu Jan Swami was arguably the best kirtan man, certainly one of the best, inarguably one of the best. Of course, Prabhupada called Madhadvisha the king of kirtan, and Guru Kripa Swami was a great kirtan leader also. At any rate, all these men were fantastic kirtan leaders, but Vishnu Jan Swami was well known as a great kirtan leader. So he was extremely influential. And Subal had opened up centers on his own very effectively, which is a tough thing to do, to go into a city alone and open up a center. But Subal was able to do that. Gargamuni was very effective in regard to money. He got the nickname Gargamuni due to that from Prabhupada. So these four men had created a crisis in the movement, and the G.B.C., the governing body commission, was formed in late July of 1970, in part in order to create a bulwark against the influence that they had on all the devotees. And it turned out to be ironic, of course, but the G.B.C. was very effective in 1970 in stifling the influence of those four men, who were then given sannyas. And Prabhupada did not put sannyasis on the governing body. He put householders on the governing body, with one exception, one brahmachari. So that crisis was uprooted, but Prabhupada says here it was a poison tree. And he says the great sinister movement is within our society. Now, I've heard some outlandish theories about this, but the fact of the matter is that all the letters just previous to this indicate exactly what the sinister movement was, especially since the poison was injected into Brahmananda when he went to India in order to rectify shipping difficulties and payment difficulties in relation to goods that had been ordered to come from India to the New York City temple. So Prabhupada sent him to India to get all these discrepancies rectified, and while he was in India, he associated with some of Prabhupada's influential godbrothers, and that's where he picked up the poison. It was from them. In other words, the great sinister movement was the Gaudiya Mat. And that is proven in letter after letter, not only in this period of time, but also later letters. So this conspiracy is discussed furthermore in September of 1970, later that month. I am very pleased that you all G.B.C. members are remaining vigilant so that the disturbance in our society may not continue. It is now clear that my godbrothers take objection to my being called as Prabhupada, and on this point they wanted to poison the whole society. That is now clear, but how it was manipulated, that is a mystery. That was a letter to Rupanuga. Then, in a letter in October, so 1 month later about, this letter was to Upendra, who became his personal servant. Before preaching, no, this was not to Upendra. This was to Gargamuni. Yeah, to Gargamuni. So by this time, the four deviations, four men who had entered into deviation had rectified their position. They were made sannyasis, and at first they still clustered together, but then when Prabhupada heard they were still clustering together, he said, no, they should all split up and go open up temples in various places. Vishnu John went to Austin and San Antonio and Houston, and they went to various different centers. So here he responds to Gargamuni. Before preaching of your spiritual master as God, you never consulted me whether it was right. This means you were inspired by some external influence. Subal said it was a mystic influence. What that wasn't clear up until now. That mystic influence was widely spread, which I clearly saw in Honolulu, Tokyo, or in other words, wherever Brahmananda went. As I said, the initial poison got injected into Brahmananda. He was close to Vishnu John, close to his brother Gargamuni, and close to Subal, and he injected it into them, and then it spread from there. But the G.B.C. rectified it, to their great credit, at that time. So, in 1970, the third crisis in Prabhupada's movement was uprooted by the Governing Body Commission, which did its duty. But in 1972, a touch of evil entered into that Governing Body Commission. And that was the fourth crisis. And although the ISKCON narrative, when they speak about it, which they will ignore it at all costs in most cases, and of course most, if not all, of the newcomers are unaware of it, the fourth crisis, which I'm going to get into in a moment. They will say that it is completely uprooted and that it is part of a long gone oblivion in history. This is the wrong narrative. It was not completely uprooted. It was almost uprooted, but it was not completely uprooted because the elements that were running through it continued to run through it right to March of 1978. So let us read the letters on this one, which was the most severe crisis of these four by far. Prabhupada is in Australia at the time, and he's thinking everything is going well, and it's early April of 1972, but everything is not going well. So he receives a letter from Hangsadutta, and he's replying to Hangsadutta, but the letter of his reply has not gone out yet on April 2nd of 1972, and then he gets some other communique from another devotee, and he says in a NB, which is a postscript, I have just now received one letter which has described your G.B.C. meeting of 9 men in New York, and I have cabled Rupanuga the following message. G.B.C. meeting irregular. My strong disapproval. Make no changes. Inform others. Letter follows. So you can understand that I'm very much perplexed why you have done these things without consulting me in the matter. If every time someone feels like something they call for changing everything, then all that I have done will be very quickly lost. Now he says here 9 men, which is interesting because as we shall see clearly, it was 8 G.B.Cs that were behind this. 4 G.B.Cs were not involved in this conspiracy. But he refers to 9 men, and there is a way that that can be understood, and that also will become self-evident very shortly. Then he writes to Rupanuga 2 days later, I had no intimation that you all G.B.C. members have met and decided such big issues without consulting me. So I have issued one letter in this regard to all of you, and you may take note that I consider that both the meeting and the resolution is irregular, and immediately there should be no change. Again, I am so much burdened by this administrative work that I feel great difficulty. I was very anxious to return to my Los Angeles home to sit down for translating work. But if you all, my right-hand men, are doing things without consulting me and making such big changes within our society without getting my opinion and the opinion of all the G.B.C. members, then what can I do? I am so much perplexed why you all have done this. I have appointed originally 12 G.B.C. members, and I have given them all 12 zones for their administration and management, but simply by agreement, you have changed everything. So what is this? I don't know. You mentioned that you are taking great help from Atreya Rishi, but Atreya Rishi is not a member of G.B.C., nor has he any position in my scheme how to manage the whole society. The 9th man is Atreya. Now, Prabhupada rarely sent telegrams. He almost never sent telegrams for a number of reasons. The expense involved, and the fact that he was confident about the mailing system worldwide, the postal system. But he sends a telegram to various G.B.C. members. These are expensive telegrams. He sends to Kirtananda, and then he sends the same telegram to all of his ISKCON temple presidents. He sends this telegram to Hangsadutta. Basically, this scheme, this centralization scheme, was led by Kirtananda and Hangsadutta to a significant extent. Atreya, of course, was the big beneficiary of it, so to say he was not involved would be not correct. So here's the telegram. Your legal material formula will not help us. Only our spiritual life can help us. I have not approval for any of these plans. Hung Suduta must return Germany immediately. Don't leave again. Atreya Rishi has no authority for me to manage anything. Remove him. So it's a severe crisis, to say the least. Now we have a memo to all ISKCON temple presidents dated April 8th, 1972. This is the most important transmission of all the documents here. It's long, but it's very important. April 8th, 1972, memo to all ISKCON temple presidents. I beg to inform you that recently some of the governing body commission members held a meeting at New York on 25th through 28th March 1972, and they have sent me a big minutes duplicated for my consideration, but in the meantime they have decided some appointments without consulting me. One of the items which struck me very much is as follows. Quote, Atreya Rishidas was selected to be the secretary for G.B.C. and receive all correspondence, including monthly reports, unquote. I never appointed Atreya Rishi member of the G.B.C., and I do not know how he can be appointed secretary to G.B.C. without my sanction. Similarly, quote, he was also appointed to be on the management committee with Kirtananda for the purpose of supervising ISKCON business and implementing the decisions reached by G.B.C., unquote. Prabhupada says then, this has very much disturbed me. Sriman Atreya Rishidas may be very expert, but without my say, he has been given so much power, and this has upset my brain. I also understand that immediate actions are going to be taken even prior to my permission, and that also, and then he quotes this minutes that he received, without divulging to the devotees, and then Prabhupada adds to it an exclamation point in parentheses, unquote. So then his memo to the presidents continues. I do not follow exactly what is the motive of the so-called G.B.C. meeting. Under these circumstances, I authorize you to disregard any decision from the G.B.C. men until my further instruction. By the way, I'm going to read it again. It's all in caps. None of the rest was in capitals, but this is in capitals. I authorize you to disregard any decision from the G.B.C. men until my further instruction. What does this mean? This memo means a lot. First of all, it means the G.B.C. was not absolute at that time, and it's not absolute. Its authority was provisional, and if it has any authority now, which I do not believe it has had any authority for decades, but if you say it has any authority now, any spiritual authority, that authority is also provisional. Prabhupada suspended it. He passed the power down back to all of his temple presidents. He took all the power away from the governing body commission. If the governing body commission was absolute, it could not have its spiritual power taken away. An absolute entity cannot be dealt with like that. Prabhupada never empowered the G.B.C. to be absolute. In fact, in his final will, which of course the fabricated so-called ISKCON will quote ad nauseum, ultimate managing authority. So, as long as they remain genuine G.B.C., which when this touch of evil entered and then incubated and then marinated throughout the movement after Prabhupada left and then exploded in March of 1978. So to think that the governing body commission still had spiritual authority in late March of 1978, with the major deviation that they brought down upon the whole movement, equivalent to exploding a 10 megaton bomb over the movement, atomic bomb, they never had at any time absolute authority. They still have power, but that power is not spiritualist vibhuti. And they glam off of statements favorable made about the G.B.C. by Prabhupada while he was still manifest. But how are those relevant with what they have done? And to see here that a mere year and a half after they were formed, this major conspiracy that took place in New York City to centralize Prabhupada's movement, which he never wanted it centralized. We're going to read a letter very shortly here, which will wrap up this fourth crisis. This letter is to one of the G.B.C. men who was implicated in it. It's a very famous letter, by the way, very, very often quoted for various reasons. But in it, we shall see clearly that Prabhupada did not want his movement centralized. But why did the G.B.C.? I do not, he says, understand exactly the motive. Why did they do this centralization? Of course, financially, the monies were all to be centralized then and to be given to Atreya Rishi in the investment house that he worked for the purpose of probably establishing some kind of account in order to make extra money based on interest in a stock market account, money market account more than likely. But Prabhupada didn't want that. Prabhupada would have never authorized that. It was in order to tamp down the power of the temple presidents and give all the power to the governing body commissioner. And that's one of the chief reasons why we can know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this particular crisis was not totally uprooted. It left burning cinders, which caught eventually. Because what did those 11 pretender Mahabhagavats, all G.B.C. men, do once they got the G.B.C. to rubber stamp their concoction of the Zonalacharya, a concoction that went throughout the world? It minimized the temple presidents. It gave all the power to the guru, so-called gurus, pretender Mahabhagavats. Now, by April 11th, things were starting to settle down. In fact, the letters were coming into Prabhupada that Atreya had been moved off of having any connection to what the appointments they gave him, that they were not going to centralize the temples. But one of the zones was centralized during this time, and your host was directly impacted by that. Of course, I had no idea. I was very, very new. I had no idea.